In the first of these talks, I want to try and explain why kinship and marriage is such an important subject within anthropology, also why it's such a difficult subject, and then explain a few of the simple terms and move on to the analysis of one kind of society, hunter-gatherer societies. The subject is very important for a number of reasons. One reason is that kinship and marriage are institutions which dominate most human societies. Evans Pritchard, at whose table I happen to be sitting, wrote that among the Nua, which is a North African tribe, as in all human societies, marriage and the family are the most fundamental institutions. Among the South American Yanomama people, described by Napoleon Chagnon, we're told that kinship is the heart of primitive social structure, and it must be understood in detail rather than through generalizations. The rules governing marriage, along with the kinship system, together comprise and delineate the structure of Yanomama society. Or, in the words of an old Pomo Indian in California, what is a man? A man is nothing. Without his family, he is of less importance than that bug crossing the trail, of less importance than the sputum or exuvial. At least they can be used to help poison a man. A man must be with his family to amount to anything with us. If he had nobody else to help him, then the first trouble he got into, he would be killed by his enemies. No woman would marry him. He would be poorer than the newborn child. He would be poorer than a worm. In the white way of doing things, the family is not so important. The police and soldiers take care of protecting you. The courts give you justice. The post office carries messages for you. The school teaches you. Everything is taken care of, even your children, after you die. But with us, the family is everything. Or rather, everything in the past. Now it is nothing. We are getting like the white people, and it is bad for the old people. We had no old people's homes, like you. The old people were important. They were wise. Your old people must be fools. Being so important in many of the societies studied by anthropologists, it has occupied more than half the literature on non-Western societies. And in order to understand this literature, one has to make one's way through a dense, jargon-filled jungle. But as I'll explain, the jargon has a purpose. And if one can master the field, it has an intrinsic fascination, not only in making us understand other societies, but in explaining our own, particularly our own in a time when the basic institutions, our sexual mores, our marital customs, and our kinship structures seem to be changing and altering very fast. And in looking at the patterns in other societies and our own in perspective, we may have ways of being able to understand our own better. It's a difficult subject, probably the most difficult in anthropology. As Bronislaw Malinowski put it, I believe that kinship is really the most difficult subject of social anthropology. He was one of the founders of modern anthropology, and yet he was able to write, describing his relations with other great figures in the field. I may say that whenever I meet Mrs. Seligman or Dr. Lowy, or discuss matters with Radcliffe Brown or Kroeber, I become at once aware that my partner does not understand anything in the matter, and I end usually with the feeling that this also applies to myself. Why is it so difficult? Well, firstly, it's a matter of examining our own very basic assumptions. This is quite easy to do in economics and perhaps in religion, but in our family system into which we are born and brought up and we never question, the task of trying to understand other systems and thereby admit their logic and rationality in comparison to our own requires a fundamental search of our own institutions. Let's take just one example, the question of on what basis do we marry? In our own society, of course, we tend to get married after we have been afflicted with that strange feeling, that surge of emotion which tells us that we are attracted to someone, what is known to comparative sociologists as the romantic love complex. Now, this is quite widespread in our society, but 90% of human societies have organized their marriage in other ways on the basis of arrangement between partners. In fact, we are the deviants here, as Ralph Linton, the anthropologist, put it. All societies recognize that there are occasional violent attachments between persons of opposite sex. But our present American culture is practically the only one which has attempted to capitalize these and to make them the basis for marriage. Their rarity in most societies suggests that they are psychological abnormalities to which our own culture has attached an extraordinary value, just as other cultures have attached extreme values to other abnormalities. The hero of the modern American movie is always a romantic lover, just as the hero of the old Arab epic is always an epileptic. Take just briefly another field. As one anthropologist has written, our own tendency to connect marriage with sex is a very peculiar association that grew up in our own very unusual society. Of course, nowadays the association is breaking down, and it is perhaps helpful to know that it is in fact a very culturally specific association, that marriage and sex should go together. The second reason for the difficulty, as well as this emotional and intellectual one, is that around the subject has grown up this thick undergrowth of jargon. Some of this, of course, is the protection and the custom of any particular discipline to have a set of specific terms, but it does also reflect a real difficulty, which is that the institutions of kinship and marriage differ so much between societies that many of the things that are found in other societies have no parallel at all in our own society. For instance, I'll be talking about the custom of believing that you are related only to people through males. Now, we don't have that system, and therefore when it was discovered, a word had to be coined to describe descent through males, and the terms agnatic or patrilineal were developed. Now, this is the case. Take another example. We don't have several brothers marrying one woman, so you need the term polyandry. And this is the case with many terms. Another reason for having special terms is that many of the terms that we have in our culture have a very specific association and mean specific things, which, if we use the same term in describing other cultures, you tend to get distortions. To take one famous example, when missionaries went to certain parts of the world, they would ask a native, they would know that someone had a woman who had borne them as a child, and they would say, "What do you call that woman?" knowing it's the person's mother, and they would say, for example, Amma. And then they would hear this person talking about the woman up there as Amma, but they would also hear this person referring to a whole lot of other women as Amma. And they would jump to the conclusion that Amma, which they translated as mother, was being used in the same sense. And as a result, they wrote down in their books that these natives were unable to distinguish their mother from other women, and probably lived in a state where marriage and the family were very loose, promiscuous sexual relations were allowed. Now, in fact, it was because of the mistranslation and the identification of what we mean by mother, because in many of these societies, a term which we use for mother is actually one which one would use for a senior woman of the next generation up. So the jargon is not merely created by the perverted minds of a small clique of people who are trying to confuse us. And in these talks, I want to try and explain some of the basic concepts and terms. And let's just provide some of these tools to start with.